Hello, welcome to A Spirited Debate. I'm Lauren Green. In Oklahoma, a high school football team regularly prays before they play, but if they make the playoffs, well, they can't do that. All prayers are banned. That's because of a policy governing all secondary school activities in Oklahoma. But it's a rule the state attorney general is calling unconstitutional and wants changed. Here with his opinion is Dr. Robert Jeffress, senior pastor at First Baptist Dallas, and attorney Whitney Boan. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Lauren.
I want to read from a quote from the 9-page opinion that the Attorney General wrote. And in it he says, a public school district or a public-funded association cannot cite its fear of violating the Establishment Clause as the reason for censoring speech, as this reasoning has been nearly universally rejected by the Supreme Court. So, Whitney, I want to start with you. Why do you not agree with that?
I don't agree with it for a number of reasons. First, we're talking about a public address system, so we're not talking about individual prayer by players. We're talking about games where there is an issue of prayer being done over a public address system that's sponsored, it's supervised, and it's controlled by schools. This violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution's Bill of Rights. This has been decided for a long time, but there's case law in 1992 from the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's case law in 2000 from the U.S. Supreme Court that specifically deals with this issue, and it violates the Establishment Clause. The government cannot be involved in sponsoring in any way or giving any appearance of sponsoring public prayer, and that's what the fundamental problem is here.
Okay.
The Oklahoma...
Dr. Jeffress, I want your take on this as well.
Yeah. Oh, look, I'm glad we've got an attorney general in Oklahoma who has the intestinal fortitude to stand up against secularists who have hijacked the First Amendment and perverted it into something the founders never intended. Look, the First Amendment says Congress cannot establish a state church. That's all that it says. But it also goes on to say that we can freely exercise our religious beliefs. There is nothing in the First Amendment that prohibits prayers at a football game or Ten Commandments monuments at the Capitol building. And I'm glad we've got an attorney general in Oklahoma who is willing to protect the real rights of students to exercise their religious beliefs instead of some imaginary rights of secularists to live in a religion-free America.
The
that
US
right
Supreme
does
Court
not
is
exist.
not imaginary.
You're really on fire. Whitney, why don't you answer that?
The U.S. Supreme Court is not imaginary, okay? And they are the binding arbiter of legal issues as far as the interpretation of the First Amendment of the United States, including the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And they have spoken on this issue. So while Attorney General Pruitt may have his opinions about this, and I can respect that, they are simply that. They are opinions, they are advisory in nature, and they are not binding law. The U.S. Supreme Court determines the law. And they have spoken on this, and they have spoken on it for decades now.
Let me read you.
Let me insert something there.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Jeffress.
There. Back in the Greece case, Greece versus Galloway, last year, the Supreme Court upheld the right of Greece, New York, to have prayers at city council member meetings that were predominantly Christian. And let me ask the viewers to decide this. Why is it for the first 160 years of our nation's history, the Supreme Court said there was no conflict between the First Amendment and reading the Bible in schools, prayers, Ten Commandment displays, but in the last 50 years, there's been this all-out assault on religious freedom? Did the Constitution suddenly change?
Okay.
Do today's Supreme Court officials have some new insight into the Constitution that our founding fathers didn't have? Of course not. We've allowed the secularists to hijack the Constitution.
Okay,
That's the only thing that has changed.
All right. Before you answer that, Whitney, I want to read another quote from the Attorney General, the Oklahoma State Attorney General Scott Pruitt. He basically said, you can't just uniformly say and arbitrarily say we're going to allow all speech except religious speech, right. And that is why it is overbroad. Whitney, you say what?
No. The issue here is that the schools are going to be the ones utilizing these public address systems. Okay, nobody has said that students individually cannot pray. Nobody has said that. Nobody has said that students as groups cannot pray. What is being said is completely appropriate, it's legally sound, and it's that the public address systems at these games are not going to be utilized for prayer because it violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the United States, We have U.S. Supreme Court justices who are in court now, but we also have had this as long-standing law that has been promulgated by the U.S. Supreme Court since the 60s at a minimum. Okay. And so we're not, it's a number of U.S. Supreme Court justices. It's well accepted.
Okay, I want, Dr. Jeffress, you get the last word, then we have to go.
Well, the last word on this is for 160 years, the Supreme Court followed the First Amendment and said you can't have a state church. That's all our founders intended, that people would not be coerced into worshiping in the state church. Having a prayer at a football game is hardly establishing a state church.
All right, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Robert Jeffress and Whitney Boan, for being here in a spirited debate. It certainly was spirited.
Thank you.
And you want to check out foxnews.com for more on this developing story. I'm Lauren Green, and thanks for watching.